In a digital age where cybersecurity stands as a formidable bastion against unseen threats, how do businesses navigate the complexities of protecting themselves while still pushing the envelope of innovation? Well, today here on Tech Talks Daily, we're going to dive straight into this critical dialogue with Jonny Tyers, the visionary founder and CEO of a company called Threatplane. With cybersecurity risks escalating in a world deeply intertwined with technology, businesses face the daunting challenge of both understanding and mitigating these threats. So Jonny's going to be bringing to the table a solution that demystifies the technicalities, talk more in depth about things like threat modelling, and how by connecting the dots between business risks and technical controls, he's going to craft a narrative that businesses can not only understand, but act upon. So there's going to be some actionable tips for everybody listening today. And also, as emerging technologies like AI and IoT continue to stretch the boundaries of that digital landscape, I think Jonny's insights are more relevant than ever. So prepare to unravel that explainability problem of cybersecurity and also discover the strategic prowess of threat modelling and explore how continuous learning can help us all stay one step ahead in this perpetual cyber arms race. So are you ready to transform complexity into clarity, fear into fortitude? Now, before I get today's guest on, a quick shout out to the sponsors of Tech Talks Daily, because in today's remote first world, I think settling for outdated managed file transfer solutions means ultimately you're risking your sensitive data. But if you upgrade to Kiteworks, the gold standard in secure MFT, boasting FedRAMP moderate authorization, Kiteworks isn't just secure, it's a complete transformation of how your business handles file transfers and communications. So say goodbye to compromise and hello to unmatched security and efficiency. And you can do that by making the switch to kiteworks.com. Visit kiteworks.com to begin. That's kiteworks.com to secure your data and empower your business. But now, let's get today's guest on. Well, buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the UK, where you can join me and Jonny as we navigate the cybersphere together and talk about all this and so much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Jonny. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jonny. I am an ex-hacker. And I joined the bright side, the good side, some years ago. And now I run a company called Threatplane. We get tech businesses secure in a way that fits with their business plans.
Wow, I feel like there's a bit of a backstory there. What was it that made you, I don't know, spark that interest in choosing the protecting business front? Did something happen there? Was there something that just lit a spark in you?
Well, the biggest transformation was that I got caught, which is probably the best thing that happened to me. But one of the things I noticed back then as like a teenager when I was up to no good, but also now it's still a repeating theme, is that security, it sounds massively patronizing to say this, but the security is about the basics. And the basics get really hard because the world is really complex. And what I realized was that actually just having the confidence, having the knowledge, having someone there who's by your side to just guide you through that is just hugely rewarding for me, but also really helpful for businesses because it's their livelihoods on the line, it's their employees' livelihoods on the line. Often the stakes are high, and often cyber doesn't even come into the thoughts of many people until kind of the last minute, either because someone's asking or because they've had a ransomware attack or something. So,
yeah, incredible. And just listening to that, I know this is a story that you're very passionate about. And before you came on the podcast, one of the things that attracted me to you is how I've seen you online emphasizing that cybersecurity is one of the biggest risks for businesses today. So can you elaborate on some of the key factors that maybe elevate this risk profile and why companies should prioritize security, just to set the scene for our conversation today?
Yeah. I mean, where do you start is always the thing. It sounds like a cliche these days. It's that cybersecurity is the biggest risk because we've been saying it for so long, but it's true, and it's been true for a long time, but it's truer and truer. If you think about, for any of your listeners here today, if they're running their own business or if they look at the businesses around them, maybe they know someone who's running a business, what you'll invariably find is that technology is core to that business. And that's more true today than it was 10 years ago, and it's way more true today than it was 20 years ago. Technology has just become a more and more important part of it. And it's obvious most of the time I work with tech businesses. It's really obvious there. You have an app or you have a website. Obviously, technology is key. But some of the biggest case studies that I often use in workshops are things like the NHS, which when you go into a hospital, of course, it's all about human contact. It's about your health. It's about the well-being of different people around you. It's about safety. It's a very human, touchy-feely, if you like, profession in many ways. But of course, technology absolutely drives that. If you didn't have technology, a hospital just could not operate. And another big case study that we often trot out is nut lorries. So there's a story about a decade ago about a logistics business in, I think it was California, which were transporting nuts, and they would take nuts from, which if I recall correctly was LA. So it would have been Long Beach, the big port in Los Angeles, and then distribute it to different warehouses and deliveries to different businesses across the state and probably across state lines as well. And they had a cyber attack. The hackers managed to get in and take the roster of the different trucks that were making deliveries here and there. They knew which trucks were going to be where, picking up what and what the consignment was and everything else. And then the hackers would get their own truck, turn up 10 minutes early or probably some time earlier, take the delivery because they had all the right paperwork, and then drive on with all the nuts in the back. And sounds really silly. It sounds like petty theft until you realize that every single delivery, this is America, it's big trucks. Average value back then, this is a decade, was $450 per truck. So it was a pretty valuable business. And that's kind of, I like those two case studies because they just kind of represent the breadth really of, what it can mean to different businesses. But I mean, the story is no doubt true that tech is just core to everything now. And the story, unfortunately, is getting worse as well. So cyber is the attacking side of cyber, where the hackers operate, the dark web and so on, is a really established, if you like, mature market. Ransomware providers, as they're now known, they sell services to each other, just as you'd get service providers providing services to each other in the real economy. But often a hacker will break into a company's network. They'll then sell that access to a ransomware provider. The ransomware provider will then do the ransomware, and there's a whole supply chain there where people can monetize different elements of access, different elements of leverage. The people who are demanding the ransom are probably not the people who did the original hack. Yeah, it's an immensely evolved sort of ecosystem, really. And that's what we're up against. Incredibly sophisticated, very motivated, and sometimes not very constrained attackers. Sometimes they're operating from jurisdictions where basically the consequences aren't necessarily that severe. So the threat is really big. And yet on the other side, there's average Joes like you and me whose livelihoods might be on the line. And it's a tall challenge.
And one of the things I've heard you talk about is the explainability problem within the cyber domain. So for anyone listening that's not heard of this, can you just expand on what it means and how it impacts businesses' ability to better protect themselves against these kind of cyber threats you've just mentioned?
Oh, yeah. So if this used to happen to me all the time, I'd been in a networking event or even in social gatherings, and people would be like, "What do you do?" And I'd be like, "Well, I work in cybersecurity." And their kind of eyes would roll. Oh my goodness. Like they'd say one of two things. They'd say, "Oh, that must be the business to be in because everyone's talking about it." But the other thing they'd say is, "Carl, I don't understand a thing about that." And the funny thing is that's true in business as well. Like cyber is really difficult. It's really dense. The technical side of cyber is just so deep. And I'm very fortunate to have grown up as the internet was growing up. So people like me have seen the internet take the world by storm, and we've been part of that journey. So we've seen the basics that it's all come from. And what you have now is a really sophisticated ecosystem. You've got social media, you've got search engines, you've got the way that websites are delivered and the technology that drives those, the databases and all that stuff that sits in the background. There's such a huge amount of technical density and detail. And then you've got cyber, which is how all of that might be subverted. And to the average business owner, whether they're in a startup, they're a startup founder, or they're in an enterprise and they're part of a management hierarchy, and they might be on a board of directors or something, that complexity is just really difficult to grasp. And of course, if your day job is you're the CFO or you manage operations for a hospital or something like that, then it's just really difficult to get your head around when someone says cyber stuff. And often these businesses are driving technology change. They're trying to use technology to go faster, whether it's AI, whether it's social media, whether it's anything else. And at some point on those journeys, someone will say, "Hey, what about cyber?" I mean, particularly with GDPR coming out, that question became much more common was, what about cybersecurity? What are we doing to protect the data? What are we doing to protect our customers? And of course, the leaders wouldn't know, so they'd ask their technical teams, okay, so what about cyber? And the tech teams would go away and they'd figure it out, and then they'd come back with the answer. And the answer would be full of TLS, MFA, it'd be full of EC2, and it'd be full of technical jargon, which no one understood outside of the circle of the cyber people. And so for a business leader, understanding what all the technical stuff means and trying to translate that into what it means for their business. Are we protected? Are we not? Are we investing enough in security? Are we not? Where are the risks, and how are we doing on that scale? That there's just a big chasm there where in the leadership room, they're thinking about the business, about the revenue, about the risks, about the compliance and the regulatory, about their customers and their reputation, all those important things, their business plan and their goals. And then on the shop floor, the sort of the technical front line, you're fully in the technical detail. And those two sides are just not joined up in most businesses. And if you try to join them up, it's just the explainability problem is exactly that they cannot be joined up in the typical business because they're just on a totally different plane of understanding.
And one solution that you advocate for is connecting the business case to the technology in an attempt to solve that explainability problem. But are there any examples you could share just to bring that to life of how this approach has made cybersecurity more accessible to business leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of the core of, you can tell by my voice, I'm quite passionate about this. Yeah. And this is the core of what Threatplane does now. I realized that this was where cyber has to go if it's to solve these big challenges of what the hackers are doing. And yeah, we've worked with a number of businesses, different sizes. We've worked with a large bank where they had huge, as you can imagine, with a large sort of high street UK bank, they have huge risks that they need to manage, handling people's money, handling people's data. There's also strong regulation there. So understanding, and on the other side, they've got huge complexity in all their systems. They have lots of systems from their own business, from other businesses they've acquired, all the new stuff they're trying to build, which, these banks often run really large engineering divisions that are building new apps, new technology all the time. The amount of technology they're building is really quite high. And so for them, the answer is, where do we focus? What's the most important thing? And from a technology perspective, there's always more to focus on. You'll never get perfectly secure. And the complexity of technology means today that just you could be working from now to eternity, fixing security problems. So the question from a business perspective always has to be, well, what's the most important thing? Where do we focus? And for a large bank, they have large numbers of systems. Even for them, they have limited resources. They have to figure out where to focus. And on the other end of the scale, our other sort of a key customer that I often talk about is a medical technology startup. They work with research teams, and they built a platform that stores electronic health records across jurisdictions. So they operate in the UK. So they have data that comes from the NHS where that's been consented. They operate in some African states, then looking at the United States as well. And there's lots of regulation about that. But also, of course, the data is highly sensitive. It's often DNA data as well as electronic health records. It's incredibly sensitive data. And for them, when I started working with them, they were a small startup. They'd just finished their MVP, which is their sort of, if you like, proof of concept to see whether the business would work from a technical perspective. And the challenges there were, we've got this huge risk, or at least this hugely sensitive data set. How, given that we're a small startup, we don't have the sort of funds that a bank would have or a big health organization would have, how on earth do we even go about beginning to secure this data? And so we helped them work with what they had to limit the risks. The risk profile for a startup is very different to that of an enterprise in any sector, really, because of the way that attackers will look at you, whether you'll come up on different people's radars and so on. We bring that to the table to help them understand, actually, how can you win in that situation? So those would be the two examples.
And something I try and do every day on this podcast is demystify complex areas like cybersecurity for business leaders that might be listening anywhere in the world. So for those people listening, how does threat modeling work as a solution to cybersecurity challenges? And what would you say makes it such an effective tool for businesses of all sizes, not just those large enterprises?
Yeah, so threat modeling sounds very technical, and like several things in this industry, it's actually incredibly simple at its heart. Threat modeling in its normal form is quite a technical concept that's used by security teams, and they look at the technical risks around a particular system or a particular process. what we do is we've taken threat modeling and we've devised this thing called risk-based threat modeling, which, as the name would suggest, kind of puts risk, and that means the business risks, the business's view of risk, front and center of the process, so that you get all the benefits of the buy-in and the kind of the aligned objectives that come when leaders and when technical teams see things from the same page, which is from the perspective of the business. So the way that threat modeling helps in this scenario is that on the one hand, it brings together business risks. So what that looks like in practice is that we speak with a business owner or a management team and we say, where are your risks? And of course, for many sectors, they're self-evident. For health, there are risks around safety, patient safety. There are risks around data. There's what we classify as a risk around compliance and regulatory requirements. And there's also, if they're a private business, there'll also be things around revenue and reputation, which they need to manage as well. So all of that sits in the risk bucket, and all of that is stuff which the management team understands. It's often their day job for different parts of the business. And those risks they often fall into a small number of categories, but as you can imagine, they can be manifest across different areas, whether it's HR, operations, finance and legal, so on. And then on the other side of the threat model, you look at the threats, which is where often we provide our expertise. So we will look at different aspects of the business and we'll say, these are the threats that face that part of the business. And this is where we're looking at what the attackers are doing, what the attackers might be interested in, the ways that they might get in. So what we call the attack surface might be, the systems that they use to get in, the methods they use to get in. And the output of a threat model is the really useful bit, which is what in the security world we call controls. And basically, if you think about the starting point as business risks, the things that a business needs to wake up and pay attention to in terms of why they might be exposed, the controls are simply how you fix it. So the controls are a fairly extensive list of things you could do to address different aspects of those risks. And the beauty is with the way that we do it is that the power is all in the hands of the customer. So this process is entirely transparent to the customer when we do it. And what we do is we present them with that list and we say, we've given you the advice on the risks. We'll tell you which controls we think you should put in. And there are lots of ways of doing that cost effectively and so on. But ultimately, the choice is yours about which risks you want to address, how far you want to address them, how much money you feel you can afford at this point, etc. So the idea is that the power is right back in the customer's hands, because that one of the weird dynamics of cyber, perhaps because it's so technically complicated, is that historically that hasn't been the case. Historically, people struggle to understand cyber. A security vendor would come in and offer what they can, but ultimately the customer doesn't understand what they're buying, doesn't understand whether the solution really meets their needs or not, because cyber is so complicated. Unfortunately, some vendors take advantage of that. But even if the vendor's acting honestly and ethically, it can be quite easy for a customer simply not to understand and to make a purchase that then they regret later on, or that doesn't work, but they would never know. So by doing it this way, we connect all the dots, we give the customer the information they need, and now the power is in their hands. They can make the decisions about which security we put in, because now it's connected to risk. So although they may not understand the technical details of the controls, they do understand, it's going to stop us getting in trouble with the regulator. It's going to stop us having a big PR disaster. It's going to stop that data being leaked. That they understand.
Absolutely love that. And if we were to go back to the beginning of our conversation for a moment, I think your journey from a hacker to a business leader's ally is fascinating. So I'm curious, has your background influenced your approach to cybersecurity and your ability to communicate complex concepts in simpler terms? Because it certainly comes off that way in our conversation today.
I certainly like to think so, Neil.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been fortunate. I was fortunate to get caught and having been on the other side, but not having done anything that could have got me into serious trouble. Yeah. But there's this quote that I came across a few months ago by a guy called Kevin Beaumont, who's a UK based cybersecurity researcher. He's on the TV sometimes. And he said that when hackers decide to do something, they can make the decision and they can go and do it. They can operate really fast because it's them, or it's just a small group of them. It's a small number of individuals. In a business setting, if you want to make a change to a business system, usually there's a zillion forms to fill in. There's a process to wait for. In enterprises, they have a thing called a change window where you have to wait for the change window and then you're allowed to deploy it and you have to test it. And making a change to anything can take days, weeks, months. And the hackers just simply operate from a faster perspective. So, I mean, from my perspective, helping a business, to understand that a hacker can see their objective and that they can just go there it's not a problem for them if they've got the means to do it, if they want to operate a certain way. And for a business, obviously we have, in bigger businesses, there's lots of red tape. There's lots of sometimes politics. There's sometimes other things, divisional boundaries and so on, that just cause paralysis. That just means that they can't move. And although no one's intending for that situation to occur, it is a kind of dynamic of large organizations. And it does mean that it just means that the bad guys can get in, the defenders don't win in that scenario. I mean, from my perspective, I've worked after getting caught. I went into the software world for a long time and worked my way up through there, and did work with a number of organizations in government and sort of defense and intelligence, but also in the private sector, and saw businesses, small and large, grappling with these different problems. And having worked with software teams, most of our customers now are software teams, and I totally understand where they're coming from. And as a small business owner, and having worked in account teams, sales teams, large projects and programs over the years, I understand what the business is after as well. So I like to think that we can bring both sides to the table, the technical depth, but also the business savvy. That means we can talk to both parties.
And fast forward to 2024, I was doing a little research on you. I see that you're also a member of the Internet of Things Security Foundation. Sounds incredibly cool, but especially when you look at some of the big names in there. So how do you see the collaboration between some of the diverse members, such as MasterCard, Cisco, and so many others, shaping the future of IoT security? Is it as cool as it sounds in there?
It's they are a fantastic bunch. Yeah, I mean the story's quite funny behind that, because they actually approached us. We didn't approach them. Yeah. I never thought at our stage that we could be involved in such an organization, but precisely because of that, the big names there. And I know some of the other guys and girls who work in the IETSF and around the organizations there, and some of the work that goes on is incredible. They get very involved with, for example, the conversations that go on in regulatory circles in Brussels and the EU, for example, as well as on the UK side with the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, not to mention standards boards and all this sort of stuff. And they bring together suppliers and companies from a whole range of different backgrounds. We did an event with them at the end of last year, so September, I think, about last year in London. And it was great to meet all the people who came to the event, but it was also fascinating to hear talks and to meet the other companies who were there, some of which are smaller businesses where I was talking directly to the founder or the CEO, but some of them huge organizations that do something quite different, but are now in the IoT space. And IoT is really interesting because it's kind of the human end of technology. IoT stands for Internet of Things, and it kind of, as a category, encapsulates anything which is a physical thing that is internet connected, which isn't in and of itself a computer. So cars come under IoT, for example, internet connected cars, which is obviously a big topic and getting bigger and bigger. Something like your Apple Watch or your Fitbit would count as IoT. Conceivably, really any mobile device, phones included, are IoT. One of my friends who used to be on the steering committee for the IETSF used to joke about internet connected toasters and kettles. And is there a risk there? I don't know. I mean, there probably is a health and safety risk, but I mean, one of the things that came up some years ago was internet connected baby monitors, for example, and just the thought that as a parent, I mean, I'm a parent, and I intentionally do not have internet connected baby monitors for this very reason. But, the very thought that someone else could access those or interfere with those, it just, doesn't fill me with good feelings at all. So for me, IoT probably will become one of the most important parts, actually, of cyber, because it will be where life and death is most directly present if there's a cyber attack and it could affect life and death. IoT is where it will happen. If you imagine cars getting hacked, I mean, obviously we all see the unfortunate events in Ukraine, but one of the big features of Ukraine is drones, and that would be firmly in the IoT space as well. So there's I could riff on forever, as you can hear, Neil, about IoT, but there's a huge opportunity, but also a huge amount of ground to make up in IoT in particular, because it's not hitherto been a sector that's been that secure. And organizations like the IETSF, I really believe make a huge difference. They work pretty hard behind the scenes, as there's sort of about 2 or 3 strands really that they operate in. The first is the regulatory sphere. So often regulation will be an important part of cybersecurity in the future. Everyone inside the industry understands that there will have to be government involvement and government regulation and requirements around some of the aspects of cyber, and organizations like the ITSF bring expertise. They bring a sensible voice to the table when regulators are thinking about that, because it's not their area of expertise. The other thing that they do is they help drive standards. So standards are usually more internal to the industry, to the technology industry and the security industry, but nevertheless make an important part of what goes on. The standards bodies exist everyone nowadays uses Google Chrome, Firefox, or Microsoft Edge or Safari as their browsers. Browsers over the last 15 years have become way more secure than they used to be. And a lot of that is down to good standards, strong standards driven by the likes of Google, the likes of Apple, Microsoft, and a huge number of others, Cisco and Vodafone as well. I wouldn't be able to name them all, but they've all contributed through their expertise to building strong standards. And all of those efforts we need to push on all fronts really in order to make cyber security globally for all economies and for all societies more secure.
I share so many of your concerns there. I think today almost every new home appliance is labelled as a smart device. And the problem is those devices, whether it be a washing machine, a toaster or a kettle, they're probably designed to last 5, 6 years, maybe even 10 years, but the software updates only usually come for 2 or 3 years. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night as well. And
there's a huge transition that's going on in all these sectors, whether it's washing machines, whether it's cars, whether it's toasters, for the manufacturers as well, because if you think about how we buy products, wind back a couple of decades, you buy a toaster. And so a factory somewhere in the world, maybe back then it was in China, maybe it wasn't, but a factory would make a toaster. And of course they make them by the thousands. They have different brand names put on them, different labels. They're shipped to different countries. And basically as soon as the factory or the manufacturer has sold that toaster, it then passes into the hands of wholesalers, of distribution companies, of retailers ultimately, and it ends up on the shop shelf or it ends up on Amazon. And so that the factory has no connection back to the product anymore. They've built it, they've made sure it meets safety standards and so on, and then that's it. And the supply chain for so many things works like that today because our consumer society, I suppose, has just built that up. And one thing that cyber brings in is that now you have to retain that connection back to the toaster. I mean, the proverbial toaster, the washing machine or the car or whatever. Now there's a degree of management. And that's a big cultural shift for these manufacturers. I mean, and it has a huge cost implication, frankly, as well. So the whole way that they think about how they build these devices, how they sell them, how they look after them afterwards, there'll probably be reflections in the way in how we pay for them as well, because there's a burden there. So that there's a lot to think about that steps well beyond the world of strictly cyber technology. Yeah, it's a big transformation.
And when I was doing a bit of research on you guys, you seem to be in so many different areas as well. I also came across, I think you did work with a leading UK high street bank, who we will keep nameless for the podcast purpose. And I think you were working with them to enhance their cloud applications, digital transformation. Without naming them, are you able to share any insights from the experience and some of the implications for cybersecurity strategy as well?
Naturally, with many of our clients, they prefer to remain nameless, and we respect that. I mean, with working with an organization like a bank is fascinating because they are huge, and banks are actually pretty unique as a sector. I did a presentation to a banking interest group probably about 6 months ago, speaking about banks. And as a bit of a fun exercise, I thought, how old is the average bank? And I trawled through Wikipedia and through corporate kind of information sites to figure out the big banks of the world. This was a global kind of exercise and figure out. And I forget the things now, but many banks, so several banks of all the names that we know, Barclays and HSBC and so on, 150 years old. And some of them are 200 years old. And obviously big names in other countries like JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, we have Lloyds Bank over here and NatWest, other organizations like that we know are a product of several, that they were smaller banks before, but now they've made mergers and acquisitions. So what you've got is these really old organizations which have handled people's money for decades and their investments and other things, insurance and so on, for decades. And the systems, the processes, the frameworks and kind of regulatory side of what they do has been kind of set in stone and built up over those decades or those hundreds of years. And you've now got this world very much like our customer, where everything's cloud, everything's instant, everything needs to be adapting. You have Facebook's move fast and break things philosophy. And so they're having to really, and they've been really grappling with how on earth do we compete in this marketplace now? How do we stay relevant? How do we make our apps work well when we've got all these big bad systems, these big legacy older systems that we have to look after? And I think it is a huge challenge, but there are ways through. So, I mean, one of the big challenges with banks that they have is that they have lots of older systems, and hospitals are similar. They often have many older bits of kit that present big security risks. The sorts of things that they buy on a 20-year cycle, an MRI scanner, for example, which the sort of typical scenario in a hospital would be like an MRI scanner that only works, it has a computer that plugs into it and it only works with Windows XP because that's what they had when they bought it. And then they've spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on this MRI scanner. They can't just rip it out and replace it like you would a normal desktop PC. They have to really make that life of that product work. So the way that our approach stems to that is really helpful for them, because we find, well, actually, yeah, there are ways of managing that risk. It's not only about keeping everything up to date, because sometimes that's impossible. And the same applies to banking systems as well. The very innards and guts of banking conglomerates and banking systems is usually really old systems that stem back decades. Again, when I was out of uni, my first job out of uni was working on some of these systems. I saw them in the flesh, and they're very old, but they're very difficult and risky to move to other things. I mean, we all may remember the TSB kind of disaster that was the TSB outage that happened 2018, I think it was, when TSB, they split from Lloyds, which used to be Lloyds TSB, as you'll remember, and became an independent bank. And then they built their own systems, and they had this cutover weekend where they thought, right, they planned to migrate all of their customers from the old systems that they had when they were part of Lloyds onto their new TSB kind of fresh systems. And the whole thing was a disaster. And although there were, as later reports found, it wasn't something that TSB as an organization managed especially well, it is also partly the inherent risk of when you've got older systems, lots of data, you can't just move it all to a new system, click your fingers like this. There's huge risks involved. And yeah, so for us in the security sphere, it's about, you're going to have older systems. That's kind of a given. How do we manage that? And that's partly where our threat modeling and so on comes in. That's where they find us really adding value.
And for saying this is a tech podcast, we've done remarkably well here. We've hit 40 minutes without mentioning AI, but it is a big topic now. So I'm going to give you the opportunity. I'll set you up for this one. Are there any trends or emerging threats that you believe businesses should be most aware of, or how they could adapt to stay protected?
You're right. I thought you'd have mentioned AI sooner, but you've restrained yourself remarkably well now. Maybe I have too. I mean, AI is obviously the big thing at the moment. There's the funny thing about cyber is that trends come and go in the public consciousness, but of course they take a long time to work out. So for many bigger organizations, they're still grappling with cloud, even though cloud's been around for ages. And some of the big trends that are still going on in the enterprise sector is how do we make cloud work for us and so on. So that's still very prominent, and it has its own its own ebbs and flows, into the cloud, out of the cloud, and so on. But yeah, certainly the big topic at the moment is AI and how it's taken the world by storm. And AI poses, I mean, there's no two ways to say it. AI does pose huge threats. It also poses huge opportunities. So I'm absolutely not going to be the person who sits here and says you must never do AI, because it's got some risks. The nature of those are all down to where it's used and how it's used. About a year ago, people were saying to me, Jonny, what do you say about AI and cyber and AI? And I said, well, what I used to say back then was that AI is fine as long as you don't give it privileges. So if you think about, and what I mean by that, if you think about an analogy, that the best analogy is thinking of drones. If you have a drone, but it's still flown by a human pilot, ignoring all the issues about line of sight and so on for a minute. But if it's flown by a human pilot, then essentially it's still conceptually the same to what we used to do. But as soon as you give a drone the ability to fly itself, then a whole host of issues start to come up around if it gets hacked, if the software has a bug, if the drone encounters a situation which wasn't programmed to handle. When you're talking about military drones, there's all sorts of difficult issues, from a legal perspective, but also from an ethical perspective about if a machine decides of its own sort of power to fire a weapon and that weapon kills someone. That's really difficult issues. And with AI, zooming back to our kind of business context, where hopefully that won't be the case, but AI, if you are giving AI the power to do things on your behalf as a business, then that's where the risks start to open up. So there is a story that I think has been well publicized about how a car manufacturer in the US put AI on their website, and it was kind of a help bot, but it was part of their sales website. So it was the same website that they sold cars through, and you could chat with the bot in order to arrange to buy a car. Once you looked around it, and you could ask lots of questions about fuel economy and about features and all the rest of it. And someone managed to trick the AI into selling it a car for $1. and of course, if you trick a salesperson into doing that, I mean, probably a human salesperson wouldn't do that because they would realize their job was on the line. But also, to go around and do that, you can only do that so many times. With an AI on a website, you could do that 1 million times, perhaps, before it's been picked up. So that's kind of where the risk is, that now you've got a big scalability thing about the trickery that you can pull off that just wasn't there before. The other big thing about AI, of course, is that it's a tool which is used by the bad guys as well as the good guys. So for a long time, we have in the cyber industry had vendors talking about using AI in their defenses. So systems that will use AI to detect hackers in their networks, to use AI to detect ransomware before it can really encrypt at scale and so on. But of course, the hackers are using AI as well. The phishing emails that you'll get through now are much more convincing because of AI. They don't have grammatical mistakes anymore. They tend to use much better tailored language because now the hackers can do that at scale, just like the defenders can. So it is creating, or rather it's accelerating a bit of an arms race in the cyber sphere. And I think that, well, we can only speculate about where that ends, but it does create its own risks.
Now, a question I've got to ask you, we've talked about so much today, and the average business leader is overwhelmed and feels daunted by the amount of challenges that they're facing. How do you self-educate? How do you keep up to speed with all these changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, podcasts are a great way of keeping abreast of things. That's definitely become true. If I'm driving between offices, driving to a client or whatever, podcast is a great way to make use of that time in the car. Even when I used to hold phone calls in the car, but some of the areas around where I am here, there's some fairly big signal black spots, but of course you can still listen to a podcast. So podcasts really help. The other thing that I really find useful is books. I always try to have I try to have a fiction book on the go all the time if I can, which isn't really related to continuous learning, but we can come back to that in a minute. But then I always try to have a non-fiction book on the go as well. So and it's typically a business book, but sometimes it will be, many years ago, it was books about threat modeling and about site reliability engineering, which are all important topics in our industry, but many more about, running businesses well, scaling teams, thinking about the challenges that our customers have as well. And one hack actually that your listeners might appreciate, so that I picked up from a book recently, is using different mediums for the same book. So this guy published his book and he had an ebook, but he also had a sort of training course equivalent, which was available in video format. It wasn't on YouTube, but it was in video format that you could get access to if you had a book. And the brilliant thing about that was that you were using two different sides of your brain to educate yourself in the same material. So I could read a chapter in the book and I could watch the video and I'd be kind of reinforcing that memory and that knowledge. And of course, inevitably, the content you get is very slightly different. So it's not just the trodden path, it's feeling your way around the trodden path. So that I found is a really useful hack. And so you can apply the same to having a book that you read and an audio book equivalent, for example. So I found that really helpful.
Well, that's incredibly cool. I'll be checking that out and how we can leverage that. But before I let you go, we've covered so much in a short amount of time today. For anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about anything, maybe contact you or your team, learn more about Threatplane, where would you send them?
Well, the first place I'd send them is threatplane.com. We've got a website there. So Threatplane is threat and then plane is Plane. And you can go to threatplane.com and find out about what we do. You can get in touch. A big part of what we do is trying to be human in cyber, and part of that is making ourselves available. So you can always hit me up on LinkedIn, send me a message, and it might take me a few days, but I'll definitely endeavor to get back to you. And we're also on LinkedIn. You can follow us there. We regularly release content, as you'd expect, some videos and audio snippets for people to stay up to date. So do follow us out there as well.
Well, I'll add links to that so people can find you nice and easily. And as we said at the very beginning of the podcast, cyber does have an explainability problem. But I think today we've been able to get around that, talking about complex things such as cybersecurity, the connecting the business case to technology, how we can fix that explainability problem, talk about threat modeling and so many other different areas in a language that everyone can understand. So, Jonny, just a big thank you for doing that today, sharing your insights. It is a skill to be able to do that. So thank you so much for sparing your time to talk with me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I think it's clear that the labyrinth of cybersecurity is not about navigating through the dark. It's about illuminating the path, illuminating it with knowledge, strategy, and continuous evolution. And Jonny's personal transformation from hacker to protector, I think, underscores a vital narrative in this digital age. Understanding the enemy within to fortify the defences and safeguard our digital existence. And through threat modelling, Jonny has illustrated a powerful bridge today, connecting the abstract complexities of cybersecurity to the tangible needs of a business strategy, thereby solving the pervasive explainability problem. And his story about aiding a UK high street bank's transformation, I think, also further peels back the layers on the real-world application and the impact of strategic cybersecurity. So how will you apply Jonny's insights into your own cybersecurity strategy? How can threat modelling reshape your approach to digital defence? Please share your thoughts with me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. And let's continue to explore and debunk myths in the tech landscape, one episode at a time. And remember, in the world of cybersecurity, knowledge is not just power, it's protection. So let's keep this conversation going, learn from our past to secure the future. And on that note, thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.